All right. It's a pleasure having Professor Schmickl with us. He's with the University of Graz, and he's a successful initiator, coordinator, and of course also participant in a number of FET projects. So it's a kind of difficult where to start, but probably the best way to start would be, Professor Schmickl, maybe you can just tell us a few words about yourself and what you're doing, and maybe why you have been so successful in the FET program in the past.
Okay, thank you for having me. Welcome. The last question is something that I definitely will not be able to answer because I have no clue why we are maybe a bit above the average percentage of proposals that could be expected mathematically. But I can tell you something about myself. My background is I'm trained as a zoologist, biologist. So this is what I studied, but I also worked in the software industry for some time. And my aim was always to bring together technology and biology and to work on that interface between these two domains of science and research. Right. This is why I founded, maybe I can add, this is why I founded the Artificial Life Lab in Graz. And the projects that we are talking about, they were all hosted and conducted by the Artificial Life Lab of the University of Graz.
Let's start with one project that we have previously covered in FETFX, which is the ASSISIbf, or I think you mostly call it ASSISI. What are the projects, or what were the project's aims and expected impacts, and what would you see were the main insights you gained in the project?
ASSISiBf, how the official name goes, BF is for bees and fish, and that already tells everything about the project. B is for bees, F is for fish, and the term Assisi we used because some tales say that Francis from Assisi was able to speak to the animals, and we wanted to establish technology that is able of speaking to the animals in some sense, whereby we were not looking for some secret language to talk to one single animal or something like that. We wanted to talk to the whole collective of these swarm animals. So, you know, bees form difficult, complex societies that are precisely regulated and have a lot of complexity, and also fish swarms are collective phenomena. And we wanted to interact with the whole swarm. This was the aim, with the whole superorganism that is formed by these animals, and sort of talk to them. What basically means we want to feed information into these societies, and then we wanted to have an expected outcome, expected reaction of that. And then, of course, we would also like to be able to retrieve information from these societies, so sort of suck out information from them, to which then our robots could react, or we as humans could react. So the overall aim was to have a closed loop between the animals and the robots. And because we can control the robots and we can know everything about the robots, but not about the living animals, we can sort of establish a dialogue and a sort of communication that goes in both directions in this way.
Thanks. I think this is most fascinating. Obviously, many people have been interested in communicating with animals, and of course there is some human-animal communication, but this time it's different. It's a communication mediated by robots, so to speak, and then also between the two groups, the fish and the bees. And so I think this is new also in the sense of creating technology to interact with these species. What do you think the innovation potential of this could be in the long run?
Yeah, so in the long run, I have to say that the perspective that we face as humanity is not that positive in the long run. So we are currently facing a climate crisis, but even worse than the climate crisis is the ecosystem crisis, because it might harm us on a much shorter time scale. So it might hit us harder in a much earlier time than the climate crisis probably does. And it's basically due to the collapse of ecosystems, due to the thinning of ecosystems. So biomass gets lost and species get lost. And this basically means that the interaction between organism groups get lost, which usually stabilize the ecosystems. But unfortunately, due to our human actions on multiple fronts, we are sort of actively destabilizing ecosystems currently. And so one way that we might to let's sort of counteract here, besides of course not harming ecosystems by not polluting and all of that, like we should of course try first. But then it might also be crucial for us that we are able to integrate agents into ecosystems, into animal or organism societies, to retrieve information from them, so use them as ecosystem sensors, for example. So if I, for example, interact with just a few animals, I might learn a lot about the status of the ecosystem, which this population has collected and collectively computed throughout the whole habitat. So I just have to interact with a few of them to know what the collective could know, for example, of these animals. And so this is already a very important aspect, because if you have robots or agents that can interact with organisms, you can turn these organisms into ecosystem sensors and environmental sensors, and you get them for free because they feed on their own, they support their life on their own, they are very likely carbon neutral, or maybe even carbon positive in their effect, and for sure they do not pollute the environment that probably other technology sensors would do if you spread them out in the whole environment. So this is a very interesting approach to make ecosystem sensing on the large scale and on the long term. And then we have the other component where we actively feed information into these animal societies and thus also ecosystems. And this would allow us to make even compensatory actions, like, for example, change the distribution of organisms in the environment, what is an important ecological factor. And this way we could try to support them to make these ecosystems more stable, requiring a lot of knowledge about ecology, of course, but this is what the science of ecology is about, to gather this knowledge. And of course, then we can use this knowledge that we gathered in the last decades.
Thanks. I think this is quite fascinating. It's because it also shows really the close link and the interaction of, let's say, the more scientific research and also the technological research, and how interlinked the two are, which is really a trend in recent scientific research. But it's of course very much the nature of the FAT program. You had a follow-up project which was called subCULTron, and I think it's very much in line with what you just explained. Maybe could you briefly summarize what subCULTron is?
So subCULTron is not a follow-up of ASSISI. It was running more or less in parallel of that. There we engaged in long-term environmental monitoring underwater. And we developed a swarm of robots of different types on the surface, on the bottom of the ground, and in the middle body of the water. So 3 different types of robots. One was looking a little bit like mussel clams that sit on the ground. One was looking more like fish that swim around actively. And one was looking a little bit like lily pads that are on the surface and collecting energy from the sun, for example. And these 3 robotic platforms were interacting together and performing environmental monitoring in an active way. That means that based on the data that the probes that were sitting on the ground were collecting, they could decide on the data, based on the data that they collected, to dive up to the surface and get repositioned by a surface vehicle to a different place and collect there for the future the data. And this way, the probes could react to environmental changes and concentrate more on places of interest and stuff like this. And the most interesting aspect in this project was that we were able to develop such a robot that was sitting on the ground that was feeding from organic nutrients on the ground. So it used microbial fuel cells for extending its lifetime. So there was like an initial battery that brought the robot there, and then like it fed it for the first time. But after some time, the energy harvested in the environment by those microbes in the microbial fuel cell was enough to support the robot's further measurement and communicating of the data back home. And in principle, these robots could run forever. Practically, of course, they break at some point in time, like every device breaks, but they never run out of energy. And so this is not the reason. And we had them running for months in the Venice lagoons, searching for interesting environmental data and comparing places of different composition. So how much energy is produced here, how much energy is produced there. And this turned out then in the second half of the project to be a very, very promising and interesting field where we hope that in the future we can further go along that line. So it is basically zero energy environmental monitoring based on bacterial energy harvesting.
Yeah, this is a great project, which I admire a lot, especially for this reason that you just mentioned, that the robots were capable of running autonomously for weeks, if not months. Having worked with mobile robots myself in the past, I know that even a day of working is a good day, let alone a month. But we also came across the subCULTron project in the context of the FEED project, the Future Emerging Art and Technology Initiative, where we had artists collaborate with this project. I think in your case it was Bodum Research from the UK who developed a work of art. How did you experience this collaboration? And was that interesting?
That was very interesting because they visited our lab. They stayed for some time in our lab. They were enormously capable of doing things. So within a few days, they produced an underwater robot out of a plastic bottle that like you would see as a waste in Venice Lagoon swimming around occasionally, and they turned it into a robot that could in principle do environmental monitoring. So turning the problem into the cure, some sense. And I was very impressed. We had a lot of philosophical discussions with those guys. I think we discussed about everything, like could there be free will or things like that. So yeah, it was quite inspiring. I hope also for the other side. And I was really impressed by that week or two that we had these long discussions, and then they occasionally showed up and we stayed in contact over a longer time. They made an installation, these robots in distress, I think was the name, which looked very, very nice to me. And definitely in favor of these interactions.
Brilliant. Then since you mentioned philosophy, let's be a bit more philosophical at this point. I mean, as you know, the Future and Emerging Technology program is special. It has been running now for 30 years. It's going to be continued under the EIC Pathfinder framework. And it is special in that it tries to combine a research perspective that is longer term with an engineering technological perspective. What do you think of this combination? Is it challenging? Do you think it's important? Obviously, you, as you said, you have been quite successful in it. So, but what is it that you think should be maintained or should be? What's the nucleus of this type of research?
Yeah. So, what I like in FET projects is that you can do crazy stuff there. Yeah, so you can come up with a crazy idea, and then you can go for a proposal with it. But the crazy idea is not enough. So you have to really think about what is the potential outcome. Okay, that's a crazy idea that might go wrong, but if it goes right, what will come from it? How will it be helpful? So it is not it sort of managed to do very, very fancy ideas, but not blue sky projects that yeah, because and you can always have crazy ideas. That's not difficulty, but having crazy ideas that have some aspect that might work and which can be a game changer. I think this is it perfectly encapsulated this. What I see a little bit as a difficulty is how you go on further after these projects. So my personal experience is that it is difficult then to further develop these prototypes into something which is more reliable. So for example, if you look at these robots that could run for almost forever in principle for environmental monitoring. So it is difficult then to turn this into something that really hits the market then later on. So this is maybe something that scientists still have to learn, because that's usually not in the realm of thinking of scientists, if like at least at universities. Yeah, and but I mean, I think there are things like the FET Open where you can then further develop this into something that you go into a business model and develop concepts for hitting the markets. And we have done this, and partners of us especially have done this in our previous projects, and it worked out quite nicely.
Right. Now, you mentioned the future already. So, I mean, having had a set of FET projects, where are you currently heading? What are your next plans in building upon these insights and results that you have?
Yeah. So my personal plan is with the knowledge from ASSISi to go to develop an environmental agent that can change the ecosystem around it, that can have, of course, a positive effect on the ecosystem around it. And in our case, we selected honeybees, a whole honeybee colony, to be such an agent, and take the technologies and the first insights that we gained in ASSISi, how you can integrate robots into an animal society like honeybees in the laboratory, because ASSISi was only performed in the laboratory. That's not very natural. And now in Hyphopolis, we try to take these insights and further develop them in a way that they can operate in a real honeybee colony with bees that are flying out into the environment and pollinating plants there. And the aim is, how can we use technology for increasing the pollination, maybe guiding the pollination, so where it's most important to bring the pollination to these places. And to support also the strength of the colony itself, so that the survival of the honeybee colony is also supported. And this is what we investigate. And I would summarize it by a very easy sentence for roboticists: bring the robots out of the lab. So everything we are doing currently is we try to get the robots out of the labs. So the underwater robots that we did first in pools are now in the Venice Lagoon and hopefully in other places. And what we did with bees in ASSISi is now in a real full-fledged honeybee colony with bees that are flying out to the flowers around. And yeah, so because this makes the things real. So in the lab, you can do a lot of things and you have a very controlled, precise environment. But as soon as you go out of the lab and the things should work in the real world, let's call it this way, it gets tricky and you learn a lot. And this is, for me, the next step that I try to do with my lab. Yeah, it sounds crazy, but my lab tries to leave the lab and go out to the outside world.
I think that's a great way to conclude this interview. I think isn't it in Matrix where the main actor says, "Welcome to the real world." So I think this is also true for your robots, and I think it's a very it's a very inspiring next step, and I'm sure a lot of work still to come. Yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you for this interview. I think we have gained some overview, not just an overview, actually also some insights into what the FET program has achieved in the past, and maybe some pointers also where it should go in the future. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you for having me.